G'day coffee friends, welcome back to the Full Spectrum YouTube channel. I'm Todd, and for the last 6 months I've been obsessed with rebuilding commercial coffee products from scratch right here in my own roastery. This is the first part in a new series for this channel where we go back to day one to nurturing an idea for a new product, all the way through the trial and error of product development, through to marketing, packaging, and then finally releasing that product to the market. So in this episode, I'll show you how we ask ourselves some crucial questions before we begin any project, how we begin to identify our target market and why they change our approach to rebuilding coffee products, some of the behind the scenes of some of our very first runs of the product that we're going to be talking about today, and the moment that we realize that we might be onto something pretty special. So stay tuned, let's get into it. All right, so every single product or every project that we start at Full Spectrum always starts with the same 3 questions. What problem am I trying to solve? Who am I trying to solve that problem for? And what's the most efficient solution that we're able to develop? So with all of that in mind, let's get on to today's topic. It is none other than this guy right here, instant coffee. It's had a bad rap forever, but let's just start from the top. What problem do we have with instant coffee? I think it's pretty safe to say that if we had half a dozen different commercially available instant coffees lined up in front of us here, brewed exactly the same way, we're going to get some flavors that we're not quite fond of. That's the number one problem with instant, the flavor. Let's have a quick look at a Sydney Morning Herald article from earlier this year when specialty instant got a bit of groundswell. A group of Sydney-based coffee pros, they got together and they did exactly that. They tasted a bunch of supermarket instants side by side, as well as some specialty grade stuff. I know that this group represents a higher level of coffee appreciator, but good coffee tasters like these peeps, they're also really good at being impartial. So let's have a quick look at some of their flavour descriptors for the supermarket stuff. Dark, oily, smell like an empty Macca's bag. It's like smoking 10 ciggies. Flat, harsh, bitter flavour. Unpleasant, tobacco-like, harsh, leathery flavour. Brew leaves a rough, bitter finish. I think this could be specialty, but maybe poorly executed. And here, best value, Illy Instant Intenso, the only supermarket option to be ranked as high as specialty. So it's very interesting that there's a pretty good cross-section, but largely negative flavour attributes, which contribute to the problem that we currently face with commercial instant. So flavour is really closely tied to quality, especially when it comes to large-scale instant like this. Large-scale manufacturers usually use really low-grade, low-quality coffees, and they just roast them in a way that they all begin to taste the same anyway. But their main priority is maximising extraction so they can maximise their yield. They need to get as much out of the raw material as they possibly can. So to do that, they utilise industrial machinery that goes far beyond the scope of what we're doing here. And the third problem is transparency. If I just read the back of this jar here, I've got roasted and blended in Australia, made for Australian tastes. Show off your bold side with the strong flavour of this dark roast. Now, for some average consumers, that is enough information. But more and more Australians are becoming curious about where their coffees come from. Just like they would with their fruits, the vegetables, and the meats that they eat, coffees become no different. But most consumers, they don't need a deep dive into processing methods or elevation, but simply a flavour expectation and perhaps a country of origin go a long way in building connection and trust with your consumer. Okay, so the next important question that we ask ourselves is the who. Who are we solving these problems for? When I talk about the who in this scenario, the who refers to just general everyday coffee drinkers. Now these general everyday coffee drinkers, they might be at home for one in the morning, they might grab one from the cafe on their way to work, then they might have one at the office. Their coffee consumption comes from a variety of different sources. Now, general coffee drinkers, they typically go to the supermarket to pick up their coffee. And for some products, that's totally cool. But supermarkets, they work on an allocation of space system. The more popular the product, the bigger allocation of space. The less popular, the less allocation of space. So for a moment, we're just going to imagine the coffee aisle in a supermarket. The biggest allocation of space is given to instant coffee jars just like this one. So one could assume that the majority of everyday coffee drinkers are drinking an instant product at some stage in the day. So moving on down the aisle, a little bit smaller space, we have our boxes of instant sachets that have a milk powder and a flavour attached to them. A little bit further down, a little bit smaller space, we have our beans in bags. A little bit further down, a little bit smaller space, we have things like our pods, our single serve stuff, and our coffee concentrates. Those things are for another day. What we're mainly concerned about today is further back down the aisle the way we came. What happens when we go from the boxes to the beans? There's something there. What that's called is a barrier to entry. That term's very important because we're going to be coming back to it, and it will be a theme that begins to develop on this channel. So going beyond the instant sachets to the beans in bag requires equipment other than a kettle. And this is a really big barrier to entry for a lot of people. But not only that, it puts a ceiling on the quality that anyone's able to achieve by buying the most accessible, convenient coffee product. There's a cap on the quality of commercially available instant. So when we present the who are we solving these problems for? I like to have a bit of fun and present some fake people, real world type scenarios. So I want to introduce you to Sarah. And Sarah is our convenience seeker. She stands in the same kitchen with the same kettle in her hand, making the same coffee that she has done for years. She knows it doesn't taste great, but here's a reality. Sarah's not about to spend hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on a home espresso setup. For Sarah, convenience will always win over quality, even if that means compromising on flavour. The thing about Sarah is that she's not alone. The supermarket aisle isn't set up like that by accident. And there are thousands of Sarahs out there settling for average coffee simply because better options are not convenient enough. Now, all of a sudden, there's a new type of person in the aisle, and this person vowed to spend less money on coffee every week. They're struggling to accept that cafe prices need to rise for the industry to remain sustainable. The coffee cost crisis is having a ripple-on effect, and it will come in the form of increased cup prices at cafe level. Let me introduce you to Mike. Mike has, until recently, spent his days getting all of his beautiful flatties perfectly crafted from his local cafe. But at $7 a price tag, he's doing some quick math and he's starting to not be able to justify it. He's starting not to be able to justify how he can continue to support his favourite cafe. All right, quick little wrap up before we move on. Number one, what's the problem? The problem is the flavour. It's crappy. The quality, well, that's why. And the transparency. We want to know a little bit more about it, but we don't want fine details shoved down our throat. Who are we solving these problems for? The first one is our convenience seeker, Sarah, who wants good coffee, but refuses to deal with complicated equipment and barista skills. Her kettle works just fine, but the coffee just tastes awful. We're giving her specialty coffee that keeps her simple routine, but removes the compromise on flavour. And the next is our Cafe Exile Mike, whose daily cafe ritual is becoming a luxury he cannot justify. At $7 plus for his morning flatties, that's over $1,800 a year just on weekday coffees. He loves his local cafe's coffee, but the cost of living squeeze is forcing some tough decisions on our mate Mike. So after all of that, let's get to question number 3. What's the most efficient solution that we're able to develop? And that's why you're really here. That's where the story really is. So let's get at it. So today's obviously a new day, but the story, it continues. So we travelled down to pick up a Harvest Right freeze dryer from the distributor, and if I didn't go with the Exile model to begin, we'd automatically have trouble being able to scale the project. So we unpacked it and set it up and just ran a seasoning cycle. They just recommend bread, that was all sweet. But more importantly, while that was happening, I got onto pulling off espresso. It was just one after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. And it turned into a couple of real rush hours, like the good old days on the tools. But the mentality here was let's just get as much espresso together in the shortest amount of time. So I dialed in our all-day Antonio blend to finish with a much higher yield than the recipe usually calls for. The usual recipe is 22 grams in, 40 grams out, or a 1 to 1.8. But by increasing the yield to 66 grams or 1 to 3, was able to do two things. I had to pack less baskets to get the same or even more liquid, and I also increased the extraction yield of the espresso. The longer 66 gram pours increased the dissolved solids of the brew that I was going to feed the freeze dryer, and that is the crucial thing when it comes to freeze drying coffee. The higher the TDS and the extraction of the coffee that goes in, the increased amount of instant that you get out. There's a direct relationship there. At this stage, this was the only efficiency that I felt as if I was able to capitalize on. So I pulled off 6 litres, and the plan was to spread that across 3 out of the 7 trays that I had to use. Limitations pop up pretty quick, like having to use floor scales and the transferal and storage of bulk liquid. But I got the espresso into the 3 trays. In the 4th, I've got 2 litres of the same blend as cold brew. In another tray, I've got 2 litres of full cream milk. In another, 2 litres of oat milk. And everything after the 40 plus hours was looking really good through the window. I was feeling really quite confident. But there was an issue with the consistency of how dry the espresso material was throughout the tray, and I wasn't sure how to save it. But at the time, I was using a groove to dial in a new EK, and it was on hand. So I passed the dry sheets of espresso through the groove, which took an eternity. But I was really impressed with the final texture of the instant. It glistened in the sun, it felt great, but once I'd processed it all and I'd cleaned up, I got straight onto tasting because I was so freaking excited that I had anything to begin with. I apologize for the next part. It's really dry coffee data stuff, but it's so important that we begin to understand it, because the better understanding of this, the better quality instant that we'll have in the future. The idea was to taste a few different strengths of the brewed instant. So in the cup closest to you on screen is 2 grams, then 3 grams, 4 grams, and 5 grams. And to that, I added 200 grams of water to each of the cups. After that, I measured the TDS of the brewed instant, and it's obviously clear that the more instant that you used, the higher the TDS of the beverage. So what I did then was I just kept on tasting and cupping them until I found a favourite, which was somewhere between cup number 2 of 3 grams at 1.5 TDS and cup 3 of 4 grams at 1.8 TDS. The 3 grams was really nice and clean and sweet, but the 4 grams just had all that body to boot. It just reminded me heaps more of a real traditional long black sort of cafe experience. The next thing was to get a better idea of the conversion between instant and actual espresso. So that 5th cup at the back there, I pulled off a double Spro at the same spec of the espresso that went into the freeze dryer. So we've got 66 grams in that cup. Then I used the Barista Hustle strength calculators, and you can approach these in a couple of different ways, but let's just start with what we know. I prefer drinking my long blacks at a strength of somewhere between 1.4 and 1.6 TDS. So let's just input some data. We've got 66 grams of espresso in our cup, and to that we've added 200 grams of water, which is our serving size for the instant. And lo and behold, here we have the result of 1.61, which is on the stronger side, but look at what's happened. That also coincides with the TDS of our preferred brew strength of instant, somewhere between 3 grams and 4 grams. So now we've got a starting point for all future quality control of this product. Is it perfect? Absolutely not, but it's so important just to keep on developing these systems and perfecting them over time. Overall, I was really surprised with how the first batch turned out. I was more impressed with the transfer of flavour between espresso and its instant counterpart at the end of the process. But more importantly, I had something that I could finally begin to hand out and get feedback on, because product evolution and how this was going to develop, it needed to happen quickly. So that's just batch number 1. We've got in the next part of this series batches 2, 3 and 4, where you'll see that we begin to work on flavour. We're not yet working on volume, we just need to nail the flavour of the product first, and then we'll start scaling up from there. So thanks again for joining me, coffee friends, and I very much look forward to the next one. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.